Welcome, Mr. Gartin.
Good morning.
Just a reminder to everyone, if you're speaking, please speak directly into the mic. We heard comments that was a little bit difficult to hearing in the live stream, so make sure you're speaking directly into the mics. And whenever you're ready to start, Tim, please go ahead.
Okay. Well, good morning, and thank you for everyone for participating in this. It is a tremendous amount of work, and the people of Iowa should know that this process is a good one. I appreciate the personal interviews I had with most of you and the work that you've done to get ready for today. Just a few opening comments, and then I'd like to spend the bulk of our time in question and answers. But just a couple of opening points. First is there's sort of a good reason why we have 7 seats up there. Some states will have as many as 9 justices on their Supreme Court, and a few have as few as 5. And there's a good reason why we have so many justices. And it's not just a matter of workload. Sometimes in these kind of situations, we get it wrong. I've been married almost 33 years. My wife Tara is in the back. And sometimes I can tell you I am wrong, and she will affirm that. And so I think a little bit of humility is important when coming to this task. I serve on a city council with a variety of different worldviews, and in some instances I have been moved by my colleagues, and so I approach this kind of decision making, I think, with a healthy degree of humility. And so that's one of the reasons why I think there's value in having a plurality of justices. But a second reason, which also is important to note, is I think there's value in having balance in that plurality. And so if all the justices come from the same perspective, then you're really forfeiting the opportunity to leverage various practice backgrounds in the decision-making process. I come to this application today with 26 years of transactional experience, and I do believe that that would help bring some strength to this team. Secondly, I believe I'm uniquely qualified to serve because in my work with the Ames City Council, I give oversight to a budget of a little over $280 million. By contrast, the budget for the judiciary is about $5.36 million, so substantially smaller. And the reason why that's important is that I believe that I bring some horsepower to looking at the kind of budgetary issues and looking at best practices and reforms that would be important. And let me give you a couple things that's important to note. Our budgetary increases for our non-judge staff have averaged 1.35% over the last 6 years. That's a very small amount. And my concern is we're going to start losing our staff if we don't keep up with the salaries. But for judges, the judges in the last budgetary cycle received a 2% increase, but that is, they've had only 4 increases of pay over the last 9 years. If we're going to have the legislature have trust in the judiciary, we're going to have to demonstrate that we're willing to modernize and improve the efficiency of our judiciary. And third, I'm a textualist. And I sent the commission's material on the Peterbilt case that I think is very important. And this commission has an opportunity to think through, do you want to send candidates to the governor that are more on the lines of Justice Apple and more of a purpose-fist approach to constructing statutes, or are you more interested in Judge Tabor and Justice McDonald's more of a strict approach to statutory interpretation? I'm aligning myself clearly with Judge Tabor and Justice McDonald in that decision. I think that's important. And finally, if given the opportunity to serve, I would continue to do the work of Chief Justice Cady. I believe very much in the work that he initiated. I believe it's had an important impact, but there's great work to be done. In Iowa, although African Americans represent 4% of the population, they represent 25% of the incarcerated. This places us 6th in terms of worst in the country. For Hispanics represent 5% of our population, but 10% of our incarcerated. These are issues that are moral issues for our state, and I believe that our justices on the Supreme Court need to be leaders in thinking through these issues for our state. And with that, I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gartin. Would you like to start, Ms. Pearson?
I would, thank you. Good morning. Thank you so much for being with us in your application. In your remarks, you briefly mentioned your transactional experience and how that would be a benefit. Could you maybe give us more examples of some situations that could expand on that as to how that would be a benefit to in serving on the Supreme Court?
Thank you. And I could actually give a number, but let me just stay with the Peterbilt case as an example, because you've had a chance to review that case. Peterbilt is an important case from a business perspective because the two parties entered into a contract with the belief of how the courts would apply the statute. And when we don't follow the statute, that creates a level of uncertainty that is going to be very problematic for those who are relying on it. And I want to be very clear on this. When we talk about our approach to judicial philosophy, the goal is not to put our thumb on the scale of being pro-business. That's not it at all. But I think more in terms of applying the law as it is written. And this has significant implications for the business community. They need to know that our courts are going to follow the law. But there are a number of cases involving easements or wills, trusts, and estates. The vast majority of lawyers in Iowa do not do the kind of work that these justices have done in their prior life. Most attorneys in Iowa have more of a general practice where they're examining abstracts. They're helping clients with contracts, and they look up to the court and they see no one with that background. Thanks for that question.
Thank you.
Mr. Gray.
Thank you, Ms. Long. Mr. Gartin, I think you just mentioned that it's important for the court to modernize and be made more efficient in order to attract more funding from the legislature. What are your ideas on that, and does it involve closing rural courthouses?
Thank you for that question. So we are at a stage in this discussion that there cannot be any sacred cows. There has to be a willingness to look at everything. And so there are going to be some hard decisions that need to be reached. We could talk about the role of court reporters. We could talk about rural courthouses. The way that I would approach this is the way that I approach things in my city council. We ask the question, what are best practices? What are other communities our size doing? Because we owe that to our citizens. And if I had the opportunity to serve, I would look very hard at other small Midwestern states and ask the question, what has been done? COVID was a terrible chapter for our country, but there have been some good lessons that we can learn to apply, and I think that the technology needs to be part of that process. So I'm not here today to say that there's any one particular step that I would advocate for. Instead, I would say that really everything has to be on the table.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Kidd. Mr. Parrish.
You talk about the high incarceration rate among minorities, African Americans, and Hispanic citizens. What do you think the Supreme Court can do in that vein, not asking how you would rule on a particular issue, though, to reduce those numbers?
Thank you for that question. At the very least, there has to be consensus that what this court should be doing is being a spokesman for bringing this issue to the attention of the public. Look, if this was an easy issue, we would have solved it a long time ago. So what Chief Justice Cady did that I deeply appreciate is he raised the question of implicit bias in ways that no one else has done, and I would continue that work. I think there are also some very interesting structural things in terms of jail diversion that we're beginning to look at. We're still seeing the data on some of those things. But again, I want to look at what other states are doing to creatively look at ways in which to minimize that disparity.
Thank you.
Mr. Anderson.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim. So having been through this process, having advanced to the governor in the past, what would you say you've learned from that process?
Thank you. I know that there are many people who are very interested in the legitimacy of this process. The fact that there are only 5 applicants is burdensome to me as an Iowan. And I want to speak very clearly to those who are watching, to the media. This process could not be any fairer. The diversity of questions, the wide range of questions that I received in these personal interviews was astounding. And there was not a single discussion of partisan politics in those interviews. And so I would say that I am very proud of the system we have in Iowa, and I would encourage more people to apply. Thank you for that question.
Ms. Chase.
Thank you, Tim, for your application. I don't have any questions for you today.
Mr. Mueller.
No questions.
Okay.
Ms. Valentine.
No questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Bevel.
When you mentioned Justice Cady's work, or Chief Justice Cady's work with implicit bias, in examining those type of factors, are you going to risk the wrath of some legislatures who say we shouldn't consider those types of things? History?
I guess I already have. I mean, I'm a package deal. And I was once asked in this context to explain my commitment to groups like the NAACP. And it's who I am. This is a history that we have. And we can't understand what steps to take if we don't understand our history. Can we at least agree on that? And so that would be a topic that I would want to champion. And so we have a separation between the branches of government. If this commission is not interested in that, I want to be candid with where I am on this. I believe that work is important.
Ms. Hanson? No questions. Ms. Stanger?
Good morning, Mr. Gartin. Thanks for your application. I have no questions today.
Ms. Eklund?
Thank you. I have no questions.
Mr. Spies?
Well, I do.
I was counting on that.
I knew you were. Mr. Gartin, I enjoyed our visit and always have. And you've described yourself as a textualist. And for those of us who follow the law, both in the state courts and the federal courts, sometimes that's viewed as rigidity. And so much of the work that the court does is evaluating abuse of discretion or legislative intent, consumer protection issues where the reasonable expectations of the parties are so important. It's not black and white. So how do you avoid the perception that you're rigid when it comes to statutory construction?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. We could spend a couple of hours just on this topic. But I honestly think that that's a value. I'm not shying away from that perspective of rigidity. I embrace it. And so I think it's important to clarify the role of the courts is not to inject their own values in terms of what they think the law should be. I think their task is to let the legislature make those decisions. And so if rigidity is a criticism, then I would be happy to say guilty as charged. I want the legislature to make these decisions. I have a deep respect for the legislative process, and this concept of separation of powers is part of my DNA. And so I would want the legislature, if they don't like the outcome, then they need to come back and fix it. But this brings up another point. Sometimes as judges or justices, you shouldn't like the outcome. And so the part of the process of applying the law is sometimes reaching a conclusion that you yourself won't like. So does that help to answer the question?
Yeah, it does. But you know, we can't be blind to the fact that the court establishes policy and perception and has to be recognizing social expectations as well.
So, and I appreciate that. And there is a gap-filling role that I believe, and we still have a common law system of government. So our judiciary is comprised of both statutory and common law context. So I don't discount for a moment the gap-filling role that our courts have in creating case law. But as a starting point, who is best positioned to think through those kinds of policy and value decisions? Is it the 7 up there who lack the opportunity to review expert testimony and to go through the hearing process? Or is it best across the street in the legislative branch?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Graber?
No question.
Ms. O'Brien?
Thank you. Transitioning from your concerns about textualist interpretation of statutes, let's move on to the Constitution. There have been obviously a lot of news reports about both the Iowa Supreme Court's decision in Planned Parenthood and, of course, the reversal of Roe versus Wade. What is your interpretation of how textualism would apply to the right to privacy, and how does that affect reproductive freedom, gay marriage, and other privacy issues? And I won't go into them all.
Yeah. Do you have any other questions on that? No? No? I mean, look, we are where we are. Your commission is functioning at a time when there is great focus on these issues. And let me do what I can to communicate authentically where I am to the degree that I can. And if it seems like I'm trying to dodge any of these questions that you posed, then feel free to ask follow-up questions, because I want to answer as fully as I can. It is very interesting to me from a timing perspective that the Planned Parenthood case under the Iowa Constitution comes a week ahead of the Dobbs case. It's quite fascinating, actually. And so perhaps what would be helpful is if I could address some of the key provisions that I think are noteworthy from the Planned Parenthood case without jeopardizing my offering comment on the substance of these issues. So one of the key issues was whether the principle of stare decisis was properly applied. And so the Iowa Supreme Court reversed a decision that it had reached 4 years ago in Planned Parenthood 2. And there were a number of law professors that weighed in on this and said, look, this case hasn't been out long enough. We need to be given more time. And so the idea behind stare decisis is we're going to let the decision stand. We're going to give precedent, give prior cases value as we approach future cases. I thought that the analysis of stare decisis by Justice Mansfield in the majority opinion was the correct answer. I'm going to hold off on giving a specific answer in terms of whether there is a right to an abortion under due process or equal protection or fundamental liberty provision of the Iowa Constitution. But I will go as far as saying that I think that the stare decisis analysis was properly done. More broadly, if I could speak to this, I'm actually real excited about the Supreme Court's discovery that we have an Iowa Constitution. And for a long time, we've sort of worked under the premise that we really are only concerned with the federal Constitution. And I think this has been unfortunate. And so if given the opportunity to serve, I think this is sort of a renaissance time for looking at whether there are opportunities for additional protections for Iowans under state constitutional law that's higher than the federal. And let me give you just one example. How am I doing time-wise?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. So, and again, I want to do this without going into the substance. State versus Wright was a case from 2021 that found that Iowans had a greater expectation of privacy to their garbage than was provided under the federal Constitution. Now, I think that's a fascinating case. Now, the legislature has seen fit to try to pull that back, and there's been a statutory amendment to say, no, police do have the ability to search people's garbage, and that goes into effect July 1st. An interesting aspect about that is that State versus Wright deals with constitutional matters. And so there's a real interesting issue before us as far as whether a state statute can have any bearing on a constitutional finding. But I hope that there is some level of encouragement that I believe that there are many areas where we should be looking hard to see whether the state constitution provides greater levels of protection for Iowans than the federal government. Does that help to answer some of the questions?
It's a start.
It's a start. Okay. I'll take it.
Mr. Hoyding.
No questions, thank you.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Tim. Thank you for your application, and we wish you the best.
Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.